The crux of this talk is really just, I have an SBOM, now what, right? There's all this, issues about what do I do with these things once I have them, how do they work, et cetera. The most important thing I want you guys to leave with today is this picture of me and Chuck Norris in Iraq. So if you don't remember anything else from today, just remember that this is the day that we won the global war on terrorism. A lot of people don't know this, but the way ISIS was formed is one of Chuck's beard hairs fell out in Iraq, and it was all downhill from there. So yeah, that was a very long time ago, back when I used to be a lot cooler. I'm the founder and CEO of NetRise. Used to work at a company called Cylance. Worked at DOE for a while doing ICS security. Was in the Marine Corps doing not cybersecurity things. I was in the infantry, did some intelligence work. Been on 60 Minutes and John Oliver somehow. So it's been fun. The fundamental questions here, whenever people talk about SBOMs and their utility, and why you should have them and why you should care about having them, it's not because, the DoD CIO said so. It's not because an executive order said so. It's not because 853 says so. It's not for any of those reasons. The reason should be because no one in this room can answer any of these questions right now. And if you can, you should leave wherever you are and start a company, because you will be very rich very fast. These are impossible questions for people to answer, and I'm not talking about just the DoD. I'm talking about JP Morgan. I'm talking about Cisco. I'm talking about the biggest technology companies on planet Earth cannot answer these incredibly basic questions. So we're going to use the word software a lot, and I think what people tend to think of when they hear software is maybe more narrow than the way I tend to talk about it. So we mean applications, we mean libraries, we mean dependencies, I mean third-party code, I mean first-party code, I mean operating systems, firmware, containers, etc. Basically any compiled code is what we're talking about here. We're not really talking about source code for the purposes of this, because the DoD does not get the source code for all of the things that you guys are buying and needing to analyze, etc. Sure, you guys do build your own software, so do have a first-party and proprietary code issue as well for SBOMs, but this is more relegated around the third-party software and other compiled code artifacts that you guys are buying and using and need to know about. So for those of you not aware, an SBOM is essentially an ingredients list of all the things that make up a thing. So in the same way you walk into a grocery store and have a desire to understand, what ingredients make up something, the same use case applies here for software. And what's really interesting about this is there's this notion that this is like a new problem because SBOM is like a new thing, relatively speaking, but it's literally the oldest problem in software. This has been a problem since the day somebody first started writing code. Ken Thompson wrote the seminal paper, on trusting trust or whatever it is. And so in the 80s. So he understood back then that how are we tracking, how are we figuring out what's in the code that we're using? And we've come not real far since then. So things that we do have a bill of materials for, food, hardware, chemicals. I usually have a slide that has like a picture of a programmable logic controller and then a red wagon. And we have a bill of materials for one of those things, but not the other. And it's the thing we have a bill of materials for is the red wagon, which is significantly less important than the programmable logic controller. But that's kind of the point. So to try and put this in some, government and DoD context, everybody's familiar with the critical security controls. Everybody can name the first critical security control off the top of their head. It's an asset inventory. Everyone knows that. And these are in priority order, which I'm sure most of you know. Number 8 is malware defenses. Who in here has ever encountered an organization that has not had malware defenses in place? None, right? Everybody has antivirus or whatever it is. However, number 2 is inventory and control of software assets. I have never met an organization in the government, in the intelligence community, in financial services, anywhere, that has something even resembling a software or application inventory. And they might say things to me like, well, we have Tenable, and it tells me about 1% of the applications I have somewhere. But no one has that, right? Everybody understands the value of an asset inventory. We need to know where these things are. We need to know what they are. No denying that. We also need to do that for software. And it's arguably significantly more important to do it for software. This is a question that, if before I die, I can understand what a requirement is in the federal government, I feel like I'll have unlocked like the meaning of life or something. Because everybody says these things to me. Like, well, it's not a requirement, or it is a requirement. And I go, awesome. I love when I hear it, because then I get to ask my favorite question. What is a requirement? And they go, well, it's an executive order. And I go, is that a requirement? Is a binding operational directive a requirement? Is NIST 853 a requirement? Is having an authority to operate a requirement? And then you go down this road where maybe people say, well, it's things that have budget allocated to them, maybe. But even that's not really true, because you have budget allocated to NIST 853, but as everyone in this room knows, you can just say, we've decided to accept the risk for some arbitrary number of controls, right? Based on what? No one knows, but that's everyone's independent decision. So what I try to put in front of people is having an SBOM meets, this is a sample of certain controls for certain frameworks. A really fun one is firmware, where whenever people say, yeah, like 853 is we take that very seriously here. And I say, okay, great. What are you guys doing for firmware security or firmware bill of materials stuff? And they say nothing. And I go, well, it's mentioned, the word firmware is literally mentioned after software every single time in 853. It's software and firmware or firmware or whatever. And so it's mentioned 155 times in this document. And I've never met someone in the government who has any controls related to these things, even though it's a requirement. So if anybody here knows what a requirement is, please find me after this presentation. I'd love to know. And then you see, I think the closest thing that we're going to come into in pure play requirement might be DoD Swift, where they're talking about requiring SBOMs for all third-party code. That would be wonderful. But I just want everybody to just think for a half a second how outrageous it is that it has to come from on high, that the Department of Defense should know what software is in their software. Like that should probably be something that we do without having the Pentagon tell us to do, right? In terms of just how people think about software supply chain security, a lot of people think about it as, source code solutions to developers. I'm not saying that we should stop doing those things. In fact, we should keep doing those things. The problem with that paradigm, however, is that we've been selling source code solutions to developers for 30 years. And yet we are basically in the same position we've been in ever since that's happened. And that only solves the problem from a first party perspective, right? So all the code you're getting, you have no idea if that stuff if they're using Veracode or Sneak or whatever it is, you don't know that. You hope that that's what's happening, but you have no way of actually verifying that. They might say, yes, we did that on their security questionnaire, which no one's ever lied on before. So, I'm not going to go through all these. This is all obvious to, I think, most of you. The software supply chain is a very robust target these days for a number of reasons. The SolarWinds piece, Log4j, impact on organizations. Nobody's saying that if we had an SBOM, we would have stopped the Fortinet compromise from Volt Typhoon, right? No one's saying that. What we are saying is, if we have an SBOM for these things and we know which component was exploited by that threat actor, we can then determine what other systems and vendors and applications and operating systems also have that component, so that you can take some mitigating or compensating action. You can reach out to your vendors. You can block that thing off. When I was at Department of Energy, was around the time the executive order came out where like Windows XP went end of life, right? And we had 2 national security systems that were using Windows XP that we needed to file exceptions for or whatever, waivers. And we walled those things off in a really insane way, right? And that's what you should be doing. We're just kind of leaving money on the table here by not having that visibility into where else we can be potentially compromised and exploited for no reason, right? Like this can be done right now. It's just there's not the right, I don't know, combination of political will and, when I pause, that's when everyone says requirements and cheers. So, you know, the problems that the organizations are facing as it relates to that Fortinet issue is a good example, right? So EDR and endpoint protection platforms have come a long way. Like a lot of these security solutions we have now are quite good. They're difficult to get around. They're not perfect, obviously. But you know, if you're running a well-configured Palo Alto, CrowdStrike, stack, you know, you have a good spam filter, you're doing a lot of those things the right way, the barrier to entry can be difficult. However, if you want to go after some open source component that you know is somewhere, and that open source component's a decade old, compromising that thing is going to be trivial. And who's looking for that? The answer is no one. No one's looking for that. The bad guys are looking for that. So the only people that are missing out are the people not with this information. Because the nation states, the ne'er-do-wells around the world are 100% doing this. Now, are they sitting around generating SBOMs necessarily? Like, I don't know. Maybe some of them are. But more to the point is that they're figuring out where are the weak points in the supply chain so that they can compromise them. When we're trying to figure out the best way to do this from a compiled code or source code perspective, it just depends where you're trying to solve the problem. From a proprietary first-party code perspective, you have to do this from a source code level, fine. But what we're really talking about here is doing this from compiled code. Like this is relevant to the end users, the products and software that's been bought. If you find a vulnerability or risk in the compiled thing, you're 100% sure it's there because that's the thing you have. If you find a vulnerability in source code, there's a number of reasons why it might not end up being there, right? The compiler might take it out, there might be some binary protection that's put in place that mitigates a memory corruption attack or whatever it is. In addition, when you're looking at the compiled code, you're also able to find things like hard-coded credentials, public keys, private keys, certificates that are embedded in those compiled code artifacts. You know, a firmware image for like a Cisco router is just a giant Linux server. That's all it is. Running a, Squash FS file system that you can unpack. It's just a Linux server. That's all it is. And so it has certificates, credentials, misconfigurations. It's just a full operating system. And so unless Cisco is giving you their source code, which once again, if they are, you should also leave wherever you are and start another Huawei competitor. Because that's how they got their start. Good for them. But that's not how it works, right? No one's getting this source code. So you have to do this from a compiled code perspective. So this is not about, SBOMs aren't like, they're not like Pokemon, right? We're not trying to just like catch them all, right? We're not just trying to like collect them and admire them from afar. What we're trying to do is how do we best make use of these things? And going back to the critical security control slide, the first thing we're really trying to do is build a software inventory from the ground up. You can't do this from a top-down perspective. You can't do it from an application perspective necessarily. If you have a list of every application in your environment, that's awesome. You're doing better than everyone. But you really have to do it from the ground up so you understand, all the libraries and dependencies and open source components and all that fun stuff. So here's just some examples of things I hear often or things that people tell me they have. Like we have vulnerability management, we have endpoint management, we have patch management. Great. That will give you as close as you're going to get to at least an application inventory, and you should do those things if for nothing else. Once you do have a software inventory from the ground up, there's a number of additional use cases you can now pursue and problems you can solve. So incident response, if and where a software component is, supply chain attack detection. So, if somebody compromises or causes a problem with some open source package manager or whatever, how do you figure out where that thing is? We'll go through a couple examples here. Third-party risk management, so the procurement side on the front end, you can do a lot of fun things there. And then threat hunting. This is an entirely new set of data for the DoD, for enterprise security teams. Like when we put this in front of people, even if it's for, and this can be for both offensive and defensive purposes, by the way. So I don't know if we have any of those folks in the room. But think about this. If you know that there's a given component that maybe you want to target for whatever reason, we'll say it's for a pen test. And you figure out that you have a very reliable way to get what you want out of that component for whatever reason. Well, what you can easily do at that point, if you're generating SBOMs for all these things, maybe you found that on one particular vendor. Well, once you know what that component is, you can do very trivial correlation to figure out where else is that particular component. So you might have one target to start, but once you collect these SBOMs at scale, you might have 30 targets. So you can really increase like your target aperture, and that really can flow both ways. So this is kind of like a mini case study, I suppose. This is all value that is downstream of having an SBOM, right? And once again, if we want to call it an SBOM, if we want to call it software archaeology, we can call it like whatever makes everyone happy on the inside, right? But what we want to do is get to a place where we can solve these problems, right? So I don't care if you collect all of your nested software dependencies in a giant spreadsheet. I would highly recommend against it. But if you'd like to, it's better than nothing. But everyone's always so concerned about well, what do I do with these? What value is there in them? All of this downstream enrichment and analysis can be done. That is super important. So the example above is XZUtils, which for those of you unfamiliar, hopefully I say this right, it was like the compression utility that's baked into OpenSSH. Does anybody know how this was found? Good.
Yeah, there was a dude who was building special builds of Debian using SID, and he noticed that there was it was literally microsecond time delay.
That's right.
On those builds.
Yeah.
And he was identifying, okay, where is this coming
yeah.
from?
One random guy at Microsoft basically prevented a global software supply chain issue because he was an incredibly anal human who knew the latency traditionally associated with OpenSSH and was like, this is slightly slower. Clearly, a Chinese nation-state threat actor has backdoored this over the last 5 years.
Good friend, Jai Tam.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened, actually. And so OpenSSH is one of the most prominent open source projects on planet Earth, But wait a minute, I thought open source was, more eyeballs on it, guys, right? If it's open source, the more eyes on it, the more we're gonna find things. Not always, right? I think that's generally true, but in a case like this, the code bases get so big, they get so insane. It's a big problem. And if you think about, does anybody know the #1 open source contributor to the Linux kernel? Besides Linus? I don't even think he is anymore. Huawei. Does that sound like a positive outcome for anyone in this room? Probably not. So everyone in this room is deploying Linux kernels into the DoD that are overwhelmingly written by Chinese engineers from Huawei. That's 100% fact. You can go on Huawei's website, they will tell you that. They're very proud of being a big contributor in the Linux kernel. I'm sure that they are. And so the point in saying that is, everyone's looking at OpenSSH from an open source perspective and missed GIATAN. If we know for a fact that Huawei is the #1 contributor to the Linux kernel, is it possible to imagine a scenario in which they've gotten code into the kernel that is potentially not productive for the interests of the United States?
Impossible.
This gentleman wins the Sarcasm Award for the presentation. So a couple other use cases, third-party risk, and you have multiple people involved in third-party risk. You have procurement, who, in my opinion, his job should be just get me an SBOM, right? Procurement teams are not really built and staffed to worry about vulnerabilities and risks associated with these things. That's just not their job. Then you have third-party risk, who can take and evaluate, what vulnerabilities exist, what exploits exist, how old are the components, are any of them end of life, or any of them end of support, et cetera. The really interesting use case that I think people don't think about enough is patch management. So think about you're updating what I would call the greatest piece of DoD software ever, Teams. That's not true. But if you're updating a piece of software, there's like this expectation that all updates are positive. All updates are maybe fixing security solutions, or fixing security issues rather. What if you're adding capabilities? What if you're adding features into a piece of software, an application, a firmware update? What you're undoubtedly adding into that are going to be new components, new libraries, new stuff. So there's been plenty of cases where you update something to the latest version and introduce net new risk into that thing because new features and capabilities were added. Who's looking at that from a patch management perspective? You might scan something with Tenable after the fact as part of your process. Not an indictment against Tenable, right? This is just not what they do, or any vulnerability scanner for that matter. So no one's tracking what net new components are coming into an organization from patches and things like that. Proactive vulnerability identification, which kind of goes hand in hand. This is one of those things that also kind of makes me, I guess, laugh a bit, is everybody is concerned about being very reactive about vulnerability identification. We're always reacting, And then the moment you give them a way to be proactive, they go, this is too much data, right? And it's like, okay, that's fine. Like just, there's no solutions, there's only outcomes, or only trade-offs rather. And so, but this gives you a way to be proactive, because if you're finding a component in let's say your VPN client, and that VPN client has a version of .NET that is 8 years old. By the way, this is a 100% a thing that exists. Are there vulnerabilities in a .NET component from 8 years ago? For sure. Is Tenable going to pick that up for you? For sure not, right? So that gives you the ability to be proactive here and understand what is actually in the thing that you're buying, right? It's like saying, before we had ingredients lists, and you would just go buy, something that was like carcinogenic, it doesn't do you a lot of good to get that ingredients list 20 years later when, you're at a stage 3 cancer or something like that because you've been eating this thing for so long. Same kind of example. If you don't know about these things and you're compromised, you don't have a way to even know that it's happening this way because you don't have that level of visibility. Incident response and threat hunting. So, this goes back to kind of the Log4j issue, but there's a couple scenarios here. A threat intelligence report, here's a known backdoor in a widely used NPM package. Is anyone here tracking all the NPM packages they have in their environment and third-party things? If a new CVE is disclosed, like where this problem became very acute to me, I was at Department of Energy, Heartbleed came out. I was responsible for like the industrial control system stuff at the time. And they were like, Tom, go figure out all the devices that have this version of OpenSSL. And I was like, no problem. And I came back a week later and I said, problem. We didn't have a way. We didn't have a way to just like arbitrarily reverse engineer all the firmware to unpack it and identify all the components and figure out what versions of OpenSSL are in all these things. Wasn't possible. So I said, I know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna reach out to all the vendors. If anyone's ever done that and had success, once again, start a company, you'll make a lot of money. They just didn't know. They didn't know. One vendor in particular, who I've become very good friends with, he was running the product security team. he had to email 635 people internally to figure out where everything, that version of OpenSSL was. And many years later, I was like, how confident were you in that response that I got? And he was like, not very. And I was like, I didn't think so. But we can't even answer these basic questions. Like, we just can't do it right now. A couple other use cases, zero-day vulnerability. I mean, this is the Heartbleed example right there. From a threat hunting perspective, you know, you can have a forensic team. You have a suspected supply chain attack. By looking at an SBOM, you can figure out, like, okay, there's a really outdated, there's a vulnerable dependency, there's something that's end of life or end of support. The problem here is almost everything you buy. Almost everything. I could probably say with a pretty high degree of confidence, everything you buy has at least one end of life or end of support component in it. The vast majority of telecommunications infrastructure ships brand new with an end of life Linux kernel on it. Maybe that's how they're avoiding the Huawei problem. They're just shipping kernels before Huawei ever contributed to them, you know? So maybe that's a better solution, but I doubt it. Compliance and regulatory alignment, we've talked about some of this from a DoD perspective and some of the things that matter. What is a requirement? What are the driving forces? But the key takeaways here are, getting visibility into your third-party supply chain is possible without your vendor's help. You don't need them to do this for you. If they're all doing it for you, that is unbelievably good. I've not yet met an organization where that was true. SBOMs have utility not just across security, not just across IT. They are a horizontal thing that can be used for multiple reasons. You know, software modernization, software resilience, all these different things. And then building this inventory from the ground up is the most important thing we can really use these for, because everything positive is going to be downstream from that. So, thank you very much. Sir, I don't know how much time we have, but good.
So I'm a software developer, so I've actually worked with like SBOMs pretty regularly. You know, anytime we do our builds, we generate an SBOM of like, hey, this is the latest dependencies that we're using in our code base. But I've actually never done it on binaries like you talked about. So kind of like, what tools do you use, and do they just like look at like DLL exports, or like how do they actually do that?
Oh man, I mean, it's a very long answer. I mean, component identification is a, at NetRise, we have like 30 different ways to do this from compiled code. Package managers, cryptographic hashes, heuristics, binary similarity analysis, symindex matching, curating all the packages, like hundreds of terabytes of package information, normalizing all that package information across so that you can easily query it. It's a much harder problem doing it from compiled code.
When you're doing it for compiled code, it's way harder than, you know, if I have a source code, I know exactly which dependencies, what packages I've exported.
That's right.
You know, all those sorts of things.
That's right. Yeah, in a perfect world, everybody's doing what you're doing. And generating these things at build time or whatever, and then sharing them in a robust way that is free and available. That is just not the way it works, unfortunately. But it sounds like you're being the change you want to see in the world, so good job.
Thank you.
For what it's worth, if I could jump in, I'm at the Software Engineering Institute. We've posted out into GitHub and other places several different tools that's the DoD is chartered at to work on. One is by Dr. Will Faber. It's called Semantic Equivalence Checking of Decompiled Binaries. So you may want to go to sei.cmu.edu. It'll give you links, and then we have our own GitHub page.
Got it. Awesome.
And since we're chiming in and talking about SCI, they're about to release a really cool report that says, hey, different tools sometimes produce different looking SBOMs. And gosh, we should fix that. And they've done some of the first research to not say, oh my God, it's different, we can't trust SBOMs, but actually, this is how we're going to make it better and more reconcilable. So can't wait for that report to come out.
Appreciate the
when you greenlight it.
Yeah.
Is that the report that they will work on in November with the
Plug Fest,
Yeah, I already did that.
Excellent.
2 days ago.
I love this discussion, and
Not that much though, right?
No, absolutely, I do. I'm enamored. I want to continue this discussion. So, Thomas, thank you so much.
Yes, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen,